move on. So again, let's start. My name is Jonathan Clark, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Persistent Identifier Interest Group. With me is also Josh Brown, who's our newest co-chair. Josh, say hi.
Everybody. Hi, everybody.
The time zone isn't friendly to Adrian or Nabucco, so they won't be joining us, but Josh and I will guide you through. As I said before, just if you have any questions about anything, either the topics we're covering today or any other topic that's persistent identifier related, then please feel free to ask. The title comes from, probably you recognize it from Poetry Slams. We were thinking we like to try and give a title to our, and if you've ever been to a poetry slam, they're often quite loud and lively. There's lots of audience participation, that's a hint. And there's cheering and dramatic delivery. So hopefully we can, even through this virtual way, we can generate a little bit of excitement around persistent identifiers. The agenda today, so in the past, last few plenaries, we've run themed sessions on different topics. Before that, we used to do these sort of highlights from across the world of PIDs, and so we thought that it was time to do that again. So we have quite a varied list for you, quite short presentations, basically updating you on things, developments, things that have happened recently, and again, as I said, questions at any time. Wouter couldn't make this one session. But Matt, who couldn't make the first one, is on number 5. So we have a nice balanced program. And don't forget the RDA code of conduct, please. Collaborative notes, I mentioned it a couple of times. There's a link in the chat. Josh will post it again. Or you can scan the QR code. If you haven't done already, then please could you go there now and sign in with your name, affiliation, and email address. And write down any thoughts, questions, anything. You'll see as you go in there, when you first go there, you'll see the notes from session 1 that was held last week. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll find the sign in for session 2 and lots of white space to for your notes. So just in case you're, so welcome to everyone who's joined. If you're new to the Persistent Identifier Interest Group, sort of the clues in the title, it's all about persistent identifiers. We believe that PIDs are foundational to much of what happens in the scholarly literature and the scholarly world. Knowing what's what and where to find it is just key. And that's really what persistent identifiers do. We call them foundational because they sort of underlie. They're like the plumbing. It's there. And more often, the most interesting things are what's being done with the identifiers and how they're being used. But that presupposes that everything has an identifier. And so we're really, that's our kind of take on persistent identifiers. They're a foundational aspect. What's the interest group for? Well, it's a place to share any identifier related efforts, which is what we're doing today, exchange information, again, what we're doing today, ask any questions, and that's where the audience participation comes in. And also any emerging and important persistent identifier related topics. We've been going for quite a number of years now. There's a lively membership, and we try and organize a session at each plenary. And we have done certainly over the last couple of years, last few years. So I'm going to move straight on. My first speaker is John Toraki from University of California. I don't know if you've been picked up, but and we'll hear a little bit about the National PID Strategy Interest Group. We'll get an update from them. But the US have embarked on their own thoughts around the National PID Strategy. And I asked John, and actually Todd Carpenter presented at the first one, just because I think their approach is really interesting and is worth sharing with all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John. I have the slides, so if I don't follow you, then just tell me next slide, please, and I will do my best. John, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, and so as Jonathan mentioned, my co-chair and I, Todd Carpenter, have been leading an effort to develop and build recommendations for a U.S. national PID strategy. So the next slide. really walks through the history of this project. So back in 2022, ORFG, which is the Open Research Funders Group, in collaboration with Helios Open and a couple other groups affiliated with Spark and other places, came together and launched a public effort to work on different aspects of research output tracking. As Jonathan mentioned, PIDs are a really big part of that. And so one of the work streams that was convened focused on the idea of working within the US context to build a PID strategy. So obviously a lot of work has already happened in that area within RDA, and separately RDA US was looking into a similar project. And so utilizing the frameworks from the RDA National PID Strategy Interest Group and working with RDA US, we had a series of community calls and working group meetings and stakeholders. We wrote up a report, and so some of the observations and the ideas that I'm going to talk through here are really from that effort. Next slide. Our draft recommendations are currently up in the form of a report in Zenodo. There's a link here, and we can put the links in the chat as well. The idea that we have today is just really to socialize and circulate the recommendations and discuss some of the approaches that we took. Our goal is to, in this summer, to convert this into a more formalized working group, and we're going to be leveraging NISO, which is the National Standards Organization here in the U.S., based in the U.S., to look into formalizing this into a final national PID strategy in the form of a standards process. Next slide. So when we're talking about national PID strategies, often we wonder how are we blurring the lines between national and international. Obviously in the US, we're very interconnected with the rest of the world, and the research that happens in the US is global and vice versa. We need to make sure that any sort of PID strategy that we're working on, anything that we're working on that involves research and interconnectedness of research, it respects not only the kind of policies and the landscape within our own national context, but also those that exist outside. So several of the conversations that we had within our work were around this interconnectedness and making sure that we had a good foundational understanding of the policy and the landscape there. Next slide. But some of the ways that we worked within the National PID Strategy checklists. So for those that aren't aware, the RDA interest group around National PID Strategies has put together a set of guidelines that has helped various countries and jurisdictions come up with national PID strategies. One of the ways that we worked within that framework a little differently than we've seen from other efforts is that we really avoided discussing or focusing on individual PIDs. So instead of looking at specific persistent identifier brand names or approaches, we wanted to take the larger approach of saying, how do we characterize or categorize the types of identifier systems that we want to be aiming for? And so this was much more of this took our working group and our discussion and the report into a kind of a different trajectory than some of the other reports that have come out from other countries and jurisdictions. One of the reasons for this is because, like most places, the US government and the US landscape has a hard time with ideas of picking winners and losers in any sort of decision-making process and procurement process. So we want to be careful about the ways that we frame and discuss persistent identifiers, and less about brand names that people should hang on to, and more about what are the characteristics that we want to make sure that people are aiming for, so that we can see the characteristics that then certain persistent identifiers either meet or don't meet. And so this allowed us opportunities to really talk about not only what makes PIDs important and powerful, but also for us to start to build a framework for decision making, and really thinking about how we can not only support those that meet the criteria, but also how we can help with transitioning those that don't. Next slide. So within our national PID strategy, we broke down into various sections. So if you download the report from Zenodo, you can take a look. Again, this report is focused on the American landscape. One of the main motivating factors there is the U.S. policy that is emerging and becoming much more consistent across our very divergent sets of groups. And so we were really leveraging some of the current and upcoming policy changes in the United States as a framework, as a framing mechanism for the entire narrative. But there are a lot of things within the document that have applications beyond our borders. We really wanted to look at how PIDs can be embraced across different stakeholder groups and take an approach of stakeholder groups that wasn't just about where people work, but also their motivations. So we spent some time discussing not just, people who work at libraries versus people who work at, administrative offices versus people who work at infrastructure groups. It's also about how do they interact, and are they users of systems or champions of systems? Are they consumers of information? And really try to talk more about how each of those motivations can interact with PID infrastructure. We also had a set of recommendations and discussed how we could invest in additional areas within the PID landscape and measure success. The big part of the report, though, is really in these desirable characteristics that I discussed. So on the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how those characteristics of PID systems and what they are for us to be leveraging. One of the reasons why we are looking at PID systems and we're trying to focus this conversation is in the reduce of the administrative burden. We want to make sure that there's cost savings are realized, that people are leveraging these systems. But it's also really in understanding how we can interact with research assessment and research integrity. I mean, all of us are looking for ways for us to build trust indicators and build trust with the wider community. And so PID systems really can do that. And the way that we know that that can happen, on the next slide, is through these kind of understanding the characteristics that I've been alluding to. So there's a link here to a blog that we did on the Upstream, Force 11 Upstream blog. I could put a link in the chat as well. There's where we went in more depth into our discussions besides what's just in the report. Really what we wanted to do here is talk about the ways that people should be thinking about what persistent identifiers should do for us and how we should be evaluating them. Obviously, there should be stability and persistence within identifier communities and PID communities. We need to be focusing on global uniqueness, not just local uniqueness. There needs to be resolvability, so identifier systems that offer a way to retrieve not only a human landing page, but also to be able to retrieve and find machine readable and easily parsable metadata. And that really helps with the interconnectedness of machines as well as learning more about objects. The metadata that can be retrieved and is supplied should be openly available. So really, not many people understand that some systems do close or put behind walls information, and that's not what we're looking for within PID infrastructure. We really want to make sure that there's a level of transparency and openness. And while the data itself may need to be controlled for different reasons, the information and the metadata should be widely available so that it can be leveraged by machines and people. And then also there's a social contract side of PID infrastructure where we have community governance that is important, where people in a community that's around a topic or a group is looking at how to support and evolve the community over time. And that's really about being custodians of the PID infrastructure and supplying important, the kind of documentation that's important for integrations and future leveraging of the systems, and as well as monitoring and reporting. We want to make sure that PID infrastructure is built to have ease of use so that we can have that there's fewer barriers for people to come in, and also that there's the ability for it for not just the PID infrastructure, the technology, but also the metadata within that systems to evolve over time. Because what we're really focusing on, I mean, all of this, both the technical and the social side of these characteristics are really around this interoperability. What we're trying to do is build ways for systems and people to be able to leverage and the exchange and the integrations and everything that is available when you have clean and open PID infrastructure. Next slide. And so within the document and the broader discussions that we were not only looking at these desirable characteristics and outlining them, and you can read more about them on Upstream or up on the report, but we also wanted to kind of go straight into the recommendations for what we want for a U.S. national PID strategy in terms of adoption and the standardization of approaches. And so within the report, you'll see sections about those unified approaches across stakeholders, as well as how they relate to the policy landscape that I mentioned. You'll also see evaluations of PID infrastructures against those characteristics, and really trying to start a discussion about how we can start adoption and supporting, long-term supporting of core PID services. Next slide. One of the reasons why we wanted to take this approach where we focused on the idea of characteristics is because there are several very important and impactful legacy systems that exist within our ecosystem that don't meet these characteristics, but do need to have a transition path outside into a more modern approach. And so we wanted to make sure we built bridges between different groups and understand how we can start a dialogue to bring them together. And then also another piece of this is to really start a conversation about the differences between centralized and decentralized approaches to PIDs, and try to demystify that, centralized is not the same as monopolies or, cabals. It's more about like, why don't we work together to handle the exchange of information? That's not, it's not a nefarious thing to be centralized. It's actually a powerful thing and something that we should be advocating for, not only in our PID management, but also within policy and guidance. So the report itself goes into more discussion about investments for emerging needs and groups and use cases, as well as how to measure success within our strategy. Next slide. But also, talks about different areas of investment and ways for us to, within the U.S. landscape, align with priorities internally, but also externally and internationally when it comes to research and innovation. And I think that's, if you go to the next slide, just want to talk a little bit about, one of the things that many people bring up when they are working on national PID strategies and is part of that RDA checklist for national PID strategies is not just opinions, but also how do we measure the success over time. So we wanted to make sure that we included measurements for not only storytelling and use cases, but also with comparative analysis of adoption rates and how we can look at policy alignment. So we put together a very lightweight framework that we hope to expand on of how to align PID adoption to US policies and seeing how we can measure that over time. Because again, one of the main things that we're trying to do here with any of these approaches is try to influence the way that research can be assessed and trusted. We really want to be focusing on not just technology, but also the social side of things, because through the transparency and through the openness of PID management, we can start to look at how it affects the way that trust can be verified and research integrity can be strengthened. Next slide. So just to acknowledge that we thank ORFG and Spark and Helios Open, as well as RDA and RDA US for its support. We are currently working with the RDA US Tigers program, which is a facilitation program to socialize our outputs. And as I mentioned before, and you can go to the next slide, we will be working on putting together a set of socializing these recommendations and putting together a NISO working group to finalize them into a formal standard. I will go ahead and put these links in the chat and turn it back over to Jonathan.
Great. Thanks, John. We have one question coming from the other John in the room. He's curious, why did you take this approach of not coming down on winners and losers? there's obviously lots of messy spaces where winners and losers aren't clear, but he doesn't think it's controversial to say that ORCID IDs are the gold standard PID for people. So he's sort of interested, and that's kind of international, not just in the US. So he's sort of interested in maybe, I think you answered it partly, but sort of digging into why you take this very broad approach.
Yeah, I think it's really about the nuance of policy versus adoption and procurement and strategies for having the wider community outside of ours understand how to evaluate systems. So we've already bought into the idea that PIDs are important. We have built infrastructure and social discussions and peer groups that all understand that we're on a path towards adoption. If I go to my procurement office and I ask them to sign an agreement with ORCID or Crossref or DataSite or any sort of group, they'll say, well, who are the competitors? So I think like these are the, who else did you get bids from? Because it's just a different language and it's a different landscape. So what we're trying to do here is respect the fact that governments and business and academia requires in many ways a more robust discussion about what is it that we're actually doing. I had a conversation where I asked for money to offer for supporting ROAR, which is a registry for organizational identifiers. And when I went to my procurement office and asked them if we could send $5,000 to ROAR, their response was, well, no, because it's got data and we have to go through a data security analysis. And can they go through a data security analysis? Like there's just like a complete and total misunderstanding of what PID systems are and what we're working on. And so what we really need to do is go back to the basics and discuss with ourselves and create the baseline information that allows people to understand what it is that we're aiming for. And if the result then is the criteria does result in us being able to support many of the approaches that we have, we're all better for it. And we have that more robust context.
Great, thanks. Yeah, okay, thank you. So let's move on. I was just going to note, so back when the persistent identifier interest group was actually a working group, not an interest group, one of the things I wasn't involved then, but one of the things that was worked on was what makes a trustworthy persistent identifier system. And I think it would be really good if we keep connection with you guys to maybe revisit that with your study and come back and see if we can come up with an updated version for the modern times.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Thanks.
Yeah, and the US government actually has put together what they call a definition of a PID, which is also another set of criteria. And I think that all these things interacting and overlapping would be great for us to consolidate them. I think it's always helpful.
Thanks. And at the first session, someone picked up on your legacy, and I think that might be a topic that we consider as an interest group, one of a future plenary. Okay, I'm going to stop talking, hand over to Josh. He's going to tell us about the upcoming PID Fest. Josh, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And yeah, thanks everyone. This is kind of a very quick update on a forthcoming event. Before we begin, I just want to say that this is the first kind of really persistent identifier focused conference in 3.5 years. For those of you who are familiar, PIDapalooza ran from 2016 onwards for 3 or 4 or 5 repetitions, I think, and was brilliant. And that came about because there were a group of us working at PID providers at the time who felt that we were getting to meet sections of the community at the side of other conferences, but it would be great to be able to come together in a dedicated group with other PID enthusiasts, PID providers, PID users, PID developers, and explore what the community were looking for, explore innovations in the landscape, and really get a kind of chance to come together and have a really totally focused conversation for a few days. And it was a big success. Now, it kind of petered out a few years ago, and a slightly different group came together and felt that this is one of those things that came out of some of those conversations in the National PID Strategies Interest Group as well. So ARDC and a few others, we were talking together about this, and it was felt that something new was needed. So with the support of the European Union, the Czech Ministry of Education, the National Library of Technology based in Prague, in Australia, it's the National Research Infrastructures, the NCRIS collaboration, and of course the Australian Research Data Commons have supported this. It's come together to set up PIDFest, coming together on the 11th and 13th of June in just a few weeks in Prague. Next slide, please. It's a 3-day conference. There's a whole half day devoted to national PID strategies, but there's a huge range of proposals. We got something like 95 proposals for the 3-day session. So it's really busy. It's a packed schedule. We've compressed lots of longer proposals into shorter ones. And there is also on day 3, there are 30 slots available for in-person attendees to propose their own sessions, hold their own meetings, have their own conversations and discussions. It's a really, really busy session. You can see the schedule here at the link on the screen. Next slide, please. And I just want to say that there are 170 in-person attendees, and it sold out like it's a Taylor Swift gig. It was quite astonishing how fast those places went. There's obviously a lot of pent-up demand for these conversations, and there's an ongoing discussion. It would be great to kind of hear from folks here and in future PIDs about how we could come together as a community and enable this kind of conversation to continue year on year. I don't think it's fair to expect the Czech National Library to host this every time, so we'll be looking for future host organizations, future partners to continue this conversation. But the point here is, for those of you who are able to participate, there is unlimited virtual participation that is still available. And the outputs, the presentations, the materials that are shared at the conference will be made available openly on the NTK repository under a CC BY license. So we would invite you, if you have not been one of the lucky ones who was able to get a physical ticket to come to PIDFest and join us in Prague in a few weeks, please do register virtually. We'd love to hear from you. We will be really kind of actively trying to blend the two conferences and run this as a really thoughtful hybrid event. And recognizing the scale of demand for attendance and the length of the waiting list for this and the number of people who wanted to come but couldn't, we'll be looking for something to be able to do something bigger and be more inclusive next time as well. So just to say thank you for listening about this. We'll look forward to seeing those of you who can make it in person in Prague. Do please join us virtually. And we look forward to kind of seeing what comes out of these conversations and what new collaborations, new developments occur. So thanks, everyone. Back to you, Jonathan.
Brilliant. Thanks, Josh. There's in the chat. Mark says, thank you for organising PIDFest. There's going to be lots of interesting talks and workshops in the programme. Too bad it's booked out. Yeah, we need to do something about that next time.
Yeah,
I think it surprised everyone.
Well, like I say, I mean, it's that we were, everyone I've spoken to about was saying PIDapalooza was great. When's the next one happening? And there was kind of recognition that there was an appetite for it. We just did not realize how big that demand would actually be. I mean, it's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. And it shows the value of the ongoing and the length, like a 10-year conversation in this group as well. That continuity is really, really critical, I think, to keep this community working together.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next up is Matt Bowes. He's the Executive Director of DataSite. Are you there, Matt?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
I've got your slides. I embedded your slides in the, so I can take them forward for you.
Perfect, thanks. You can jump right in there, Jonathan, into the next slide. So yeah, as the title indicates, I'm going to be talking a bit about DataSite and also the efforts that we've been working on to grow through collaborative partnerships. This has been core to our ethos since our founding as a global community, and continues to help us shape and partner with other organizations and infrastructures across the community. Collectively at DataSite, we really focus on connecting research outputs and resources. So this is from data and preprints through to images and samples, even extends to things like data management plans. There's a wide array of research outputs and resources. We've been registering a number of research outputs and resources right back from our founding and continue to do so today. Our focus really as a community is in the creation and management of metadata records, persistent identifier metadata records, and it's really important that we tie those two together, that the persistent identifier is only as valuable as the metadata associated with it, that we enhance research workflows, and so building that into existing workflows that the community taps into, or different researchers, different administrators, different stakeholders across the community work within. And then finally, enabling the discovery and reuse of research outputs and resources. Next slide, please. Our vision is connecting research, advancing knowledge. And so I like to frame this, and this is a bit, Matt, going off tangent a bit, but really trying to visualize this and talk about this is that we talk about the how, and that's the connecting the research outputs and resources. And advancing through that connection through bringing rigor. And what we're doing this with is the research and the knowledge, which is described by the rich metadata that we have in these persistent identifier records. Next slide, please. We work across the community, and so DataCite is sustainable as a global member community. We also do look at projects in cases where we have interesting opportunities to work with collaborative stakeholders on innovative opportunities. But we also work with integrators across the community to integrate different workflows, collaborators that help us enable discovery, promote reuse, as well as policymakers that are helping really lead in shaping policy and guidelines to promote the reuse of metadata. And really what the intention of this slide was to just indicate that to be part of the DataCite community doesn't necessarily, there's not one size that fits all, if that makes sense. And so we work with a number of different types of stakeholders, and there's many different opportunities to work with us as a global community. Next slide, please. Briefly just about DataCite and just kind of coming back to, I've spoken a bit about our vision and a bit about really how we work together, but what drives us as a community is a common interest, and the common interest is that we want to ensure that these research outputs and resources are openly available and connected, so that this can advance knowledge. Globally, we are spread across 52 countries with over 3,100 repositories, and we're seeing really interesting growth in terms of the number of DOIs, but also importantly, alongside that growth, the use of those DOIs and the metadata associated with those DOIs. Next slide, please. Bringing this together in a metadata store is really important if we want to deliver on the promise of advancing knowledge. And so we can have persistent identifiers and metadata. And when I talk to a lot of folks in the community, the registration of persistent identifiers and metadata is the more straightforward piece. Obviously, there's metadata considerations and different properties, but the actual technical aspect of setting that technology up is more straightforward. But it's taking that a step further and really building a robust ecosystem around that, and building those connections and overlaying services on that. And so we're talking about discovery layers such as interfaces, APIs, as well as services that can help normalize or validate information, metadata properties, as well as services that enhance or enrich metadata. Those are the more intricate pieces, and we're doing a lot of work on that at DataCite, so that we can really power this vision across the community. And this is just a snapshot of something in DataCite Commons. This on the right-hand side is a data management plan, And you can see all of the different research outputs that are linked to this data management plan that was registered by California Digital Library. You can see the different contributors to these different outputs and the different outputs on the far bottom right and that they contributed to. And we started developing interesting functionality in some of the interfaces, like a research facility administrator can now go download this report and supplement their reporting workflows. This is all obviously open via open APIs, and you can also extract different visualizations that make it useful in different workflows. Next slide, please. One thing that we've really been focusing on, and we have done so since our founding, but really emphasizing the importance of collaboration is through partnerships. And so we've identified 3 key areas that we look for in partnerships, and it's not all inclusive. It's really that these partnerships need to touch at least one of these areas. And so the first one is around common communication channels and activities that help support the community. And the other is improving and validating workflows. So common approaches with a shared focus. And then the third is collaboratively actually building services and tools that serve these community use cases across the partnerships. Next slide, please. Many of you would have heard about some of the partnerships that we've launched in the last 2 years, IGSN, RAID, and DISCO specifically. And if I can bring these all together in why do we partner with these communities, and this is a really nice opportunity where we've brought together a community of communities and collaboratively tackling common challenges that we have in the community. And so the partnership specifically with these communities is across 5 key areas. One is metadata registration. So we're working to register, persist, and identify metadata, really looking at the different crosswalks, but also ensuring that there's automatic integration into some of the downstream services, such as the PID graph and discovery layers that I indicated. We also provide that flexibility and portability, so we avoid any lock-in. And so obviously there is a commitment to using a type of persistent identifier, but there's also a lot of flexibility, particularly within the handle-based persistent identifier ecosystem, and avoids lock-in and portability. So this is something important that, you know, we really want to deliver on the value, and we're not trying to lock people in and say, well, if you come along this path, you can't ever get out of it. But we're also confident in our approach that we do add value and that we will continue to work together. But that's an important aspect of how we approach these partnerships. Cost efficiency is a key piece. I think we often in the persistent identifier community, some fees are a bit more transparent and upfront, particularly in a more centralized model. And there's no wrong or right model, but it's important that we compare apples with apples. And the one thing that we strive for within the DataCite global community is that we all benefit from collective cost efficiency gains. And the same applies across the DOI ecosystem as well, is that we all benefit from the collective. And you'll hear from Larry, I'm sure, in a moment, a bit about some of those efficiency gains and this incredible ecosystem that we have and technical infrastructure that powers us. So this is really important. It reduces the cost and burden on the community stakeholders. We also then support existing development, so we can use the existing services, we can continue to innovate together. And so with all of these different partnerships, we have these partnership steering groups that continue to think about, well, what are the use cases? How can we better address these? How can we improve the services? What metadata changes need to happen? But we also look at technologies that can support extended metadata resolution. That's something that's common at DataCite, is that we store core metadata, but there's often a custom metadata schema that exists within a repository or database beyond what is registered in the DOI metadata. And so we have different technologies that can help support that. And there's many different options out there in the community and ways to do this. And then there's also the smooth transition and collaboration. If I look as an example in our partnership with RAID, the DataCite community to date has registered between 70 and 100,000 projects. And I say that because there's different ways that people have tagged them in a free text element in the metadata property. But working on these partnerships and working with, RAID in this instance of projects is that it helps facilitate that transition and brings the community together rather than further fragmenting and working alongside each other. We'd rather work together, and this is really important. So really great opportunity. Next slide, please. In addition to these key partnerships, we also work on global initiatives, and I just wanted to briefly call these out. So the Research Organization Registry, ROR, as you know, the ROR director and the technical team for ROR sits within DataCite, but this is part of our collaboration as ROR as a global initiative with California Digital Library and Crossref that we maintain and run the ROR Research Organization Registry. Another similar partnership is Make Data Count. This is a global initiative again that helps support furthering responsible data metrics across the global community, both through thought leadership, advocacy efforts, but also building technology and basic infrastructure that can support this movement. And so we are the fiscal host for Make Data Count, but also work collaboratively among a number of organizations on this. Next slide. And to close it all out, I just wanted to kind of emphasize that as DataCite, we really see ourselves as a central store and a collaborative space for persistent identifier metadata, where researchers, institutions, funders, and governments really converge to share, access, and manage research metadata. And by providing a robust infrastructure, and importantly, that infrastructure is not a standalone organization providing that. It's the global community that has all of these different links into this infrastructure, that we facilitate collectively the seamless collaboration and knowledge advancement. So this is something that's really important to us, and really focusing on community partnerships, growing together and shaping the future as a community. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. We're just slightly behind on time, but we've got time for a question if there is one. I just had it's a kind of question comment. When we were listening to John Chinaki talking about the US PID strategy, and you saw the legacy systems, and that was a bit of an issue at the first session we had. People were asking, what can we do with these legacy systems that miss an important, let's say they miss the resolution element. And I was immediately thought that particularly your IGSN example is a good one to share with the community about how what they needed, why they came to you, how that decision making happened. So maybe that's something for the future that we could use as an exemplar for how you could sort of transition smoothly a legacy into something.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really good opportunity to kind of work with an existing community that was well established and ensure that we have a robust solution in place for the future.
Great, thanks, Matt. Thanks very much. So we're going to move swiftly on to Larry. I'm going to call up his slides. Welcome, Larry. I think Larry's presented at more persistent identifier interest group meetings than anyone else. So we should give you next time. We should give you a badge or a medal for
like a Saturday Night Live
contribution to the cause.
Yes, it has something to do with age. Okay, so now, as last time, Jonathan, all I see on the screen is you, not me. Is there a reason for that? Are other people seeing me?
I see you.
Okay, thanks.
We see you. We've got, yeah, okay. It's fine. We've got you and the slides.
I'll just imagine that I look great. Okay, so this is PIDs at scale. And scale here, we're talking about the kind of scale you can do with computing and networks, which is inherently different from other kinds of scale. You can't build a 100-story frame house out of wood; it would fall over. But you can get the equivalent of a 100-story house or a 1,000,000-story house in computing if you do the architecture correctly. And there's some other things. So that's what we're going to talk about. The first real slide, Jonathan, please. So this is building on an established base, DOIs as an exemplar, and also underlying the DOI is the handle system in terms of resolution. So in March of 2000, we had about 60,000 DOI resolutions during that month. In March of 2024, we had 1.7 billion resolutions. So that's a many million-fold increase in traffic and level of service. In March of 2000, there's a technical staff responsible for that of 4 people. In March of 2024, we also had a technical staff of 4 people. So we went up millions of times in terms of traffic level of service with the same number of people. So how did we do that? That's going to be my example of scalability. There's a number of ways to cut it. I divided into architecture, externalities, and experience. Architecture is scalability that I referenced, the ability to increase just by buying more computers, just by getting more network, by having better networks, better computers. You don't change the fundamentals of the system. The system remains the same. Just the environment, it adjusts to the environment around it and gets better. The internet itself is one of the primary examples of that. The protocols, the basic protocols of the internet have been around an astoundingly long time. When Bob and Vint figured this out, they were, computers didn't get up and walk around the building. And people did not carry them in their pockets. You were looking at terminals with flashing, letters that came up one at a time. Yet, all the development and advances that have happened since then, the basic protocols are still there. That was our goal in the handle system. Not surprisingly, the same guy was behind it. Scalability in network services, it automatically comes with being distributed, so you avoid single points of failure. And also importantly, restricted functionality. I sometimes say that my main job in the last 20, 25 years has been keeping functionality out of the handle system. You want to have a simple set of functions that will survive changes in the technical environment. It's a one-trick pony. You give it an identifier and it returns to you pieces of information about that identifier that the people who are minted it, who manage the entity being identified, think you need, you, the client, machine, or person, need to utilize that thing. Another approach, but another factor here that the restricted functionality helps with is taking advantage of externalities. So the network is a lot different than it used to be. Computers are a lot different than they used to be, but the basic handle infrastructure has remained the same. I'll do a little bit of detail in there. And then finally, experience, or I like the Kaizen, the Japanese word, for continual improvement. We don't have a lot of big bang changes, but we look for opportunities to change it over time as it goes along. We've made a lot of those. Next slide, please. So we'll start by looking at the architecture. This rather complicated slide, which looks a little better in a build, is supposed to demonstrate an important feature of the handle system, which is the number of trips out onto the network, which is the main performance determination in terms of net latency. How long does it take to resolve an identifier? Is independent of the number of handles, the number of handle servers, the number of handle service sites, the number of handle services. And it works as shown on the slide here. We have this mythical handle 10.152/59.5. If that is a valid handle, that means that there is another handle in the root system, the global handle registry, of the form 0.NA/10.152. And if you resolve that handle, and the clients are born knowing how to resolve that handle, then you get back the information about where, generally multiple places, where you can resolve that handle. And it's shown there at the bottom, the little red oval circled. That's a server in a certain service. And that's where you find the information relative to the identified entity. And it doesn't matter if there's 10 handles, 1 million handles, 1 billion handles, or 1 trillion handles, or that number of servers. The number of trips to the network is the same. Next slide, please. And this is a artist's rendition of the digital structure that you get back when you resolve a prefix. It tells you all the places where you can go to resolve that handle, and it gives you IP addresses and ports and all the little niggly details that clients need, and public keys, and you can put other things in there as well that I won't go into. Next slide, please. The keeping things simple is also useful in terms of the kind of services you can provide. So, well, there's no particular limit to what information you associate with an identifier here. And that allows you to apply it to many different things. So here's an example. These are, we've done this experimentally. I don't know if anyone's doing it in a production sense, but this is an application server talking to a service that monitors a group of remote sensors. So how would we do this? Well, we do it exactly the way you get a pointer to an article from Crossref for a data set from DataSite. So that big complicated slide 2 slides ago is encompassed there in the little blue internet cloud. And the process is the same. You make those 2 trips out to the network, fewer if you have the information cached. And what you get back is a set of triples: handle, type, value, handle, type, value, handle, type, value. And that's a set of triples that's designed for a certain set of applications to be able to talk to a certain set of services. It would give you the access point to the sensor, the protocol interface to the sensor, the public key, lets you validate the signature, validates the handle record itself, and so on. And you get from one set of clients to one set of services. And it's the same process, the same infrastructure, goes back and forth. Next slide, please. So these that stay in your lane, simplicity, keep it simple, also allows you to take advantage of evolving network services. So I'll go back to the March of 2000 example again. March of 2000, if we wanted to set up another handle server to resolve DOI, say, somewhere in the network, we'd start by speccing out server costs. We'd send a purchase order to Western Digital or someplace like that. It would come in a box. We'd take the top off. We'd put memory in it. We'd put it in the back room, or we'd put it in the trunk of a car and take it out to a co-location center that had bulletproof glass and diesel generators. We don't do any of that anymore. Now we can set up virtual servers anywhere on the planet within minutes. These next 2 bullets, the 8 to 48 machines, that relates to the proxy servers. As I'm speaking, I can't tell you if there's 8 proxy servers providing access to the handle system or 48. That number varies by traffic. It just goes up and down as needed while we sleep or while we talk in conferences. And if we ever needed more than 48, we can reconfigure that within a matter of minutes. That's the kind of scalability that we had trouble with 20 years ago, but now it's easy. So we were able to take advantage of those advances. We also take advantage of content delivery platforms. Going back to 2000, or maybe a little after 2000, we purchased a pair of big honking Cisco servers. I forget their names. They cost $50,000 or $100,000 a piece. We had to employ special consultants to take care of them. They were very specialized things. They load balanced. They took inquiries and sent them to the server best able to answer them. We don't do that anymore. We pay Cloudflare to do that, and we pay them remarkably little compared to what we paid for 20 years ago. Cloudflare automatically does health checking and looks at the servers that are busy, the servers that aren't busy, knows where the client is coming from, and picks the optimum server to ask the question of and return the answer. And it does that, again, around the clock, pretty flawlessly. Next slide, please. Simple core functionality equals application flexibility. This is, again, the keep it simple. And DOI is an example of this. So that basic fundamental infrastructure, that 2 trips out to the network, associate any information you want with the identifier, meant that DOI, without any basic changes to the technical infrastructure, has gone from being used in journal publishing to government reports to data publishing, movies and TV shows. Every movie you see has a DOI associated with it. You don't see it, it's not for public, but they're there. Scientific instruments, construction products now, natural history specimens, that was the disco reference. Research projects, now human and digital talent, there's DOIs for cartoon characters. Who knows what's next? But the idea that you can apply this infrastructure at a very general level gives you scalability and application, as well as the technical scalability. Next slide, please. I believe this is the last one. So this is continuous improvement. So, and I'm catching up on my communications of the Association of Computing Machinery, and I just read yesterday an article about how to manage big software projects, and I was happy to see that this was one of 4 important points, which is continuous improvements. You don't just rest on your laurels. Look at the parts of the system that could work better, even though maybe you don't need to work them better right now. Need them to work better right now, but find those pieces and fix them before they give you trouble. So I got together with the technical team and we came up with what have we done over the last decade. Here are some examples of that. That root service that tells you where to go for every handle. It used to be a primary secondary setup. So there was no single point of failure for resolution, but there was a single point of failure for administration. That's gone now. We have a multi-primary root. It had also improved performance. You used to change the values, one of those triples in a handle, you had to delete the handle and recreate it. Or you had to go in and identify individual handle values and do those one at a time. That we introduced a new function called overwrite when exists. So if you have an existing handle and you give it a new version, it just overwrites it. The handle system was initially designed, and still has a bits on the wire protocol. That is, you don't need HTTP, you don't need anything that's been developed, but of course that's what people know how to use, developers especially. So we introduced a HTTP JSON API that allows you to make all the native requests using a REST API. We use Cloudflare and AWS as described before for auto scaling. We've made improvements to the DOI log analysis, and just recently we improved geolocation for DOI proxy requests to identify where it was coming. So that's what's happened over those years, and it's been a function of a well-designed architecture. And keeping it simple, that allows you to take advantage of new developments and allows you to apply it to new domains and pay attention to the details. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Larry. As always, wonderful. We're doing okay for time. Are there any questions to Larry? I'd be interested to see whether the different, click on the US national PID strategy, whether they look at scalability of. I think has led partly to some of the legacy systems. Inability to scale or difficulty to scale And I think I often think that's something that's underestimated at the start. So I think your comments are very timely. Okay, we've always had a bit of a tradition to connect between the different interest groups. Persistent identifiers span all sorts of applications, of course, and all sorts of interest groups and working groups pop up all over RDA. So I'm really pleased that we've got a couple of updates from two other interest groups that you may or may not have been able to attend. We've got the PIDs in Tools interest group, and Rory is going to talk to that just shortly, and the National PID Strategy interest group, and John is going to talk to that. So Rory, are you there?
I am indeed.
Fantastic. Here are your slides. Take it away. Do you want to introduce yourself? Oh, sorry. I think I did that last time, didn't I?
Hi, thanks, Jonathan.
Welcome.
Yeah, so I'm pleased to report that I gave this presentation at the session last week, but I've actually got some new things to discuss and resonating very nicely with some of the other things which people have discussed today. So this is not just going to be a repeat. So next slide, please. So I added a bit of background to the group. So what was the origin? PIDs in Tools was founded a couple of years ago, and we've actually been very active since then. And I think our momentum is growing, which is nice. We have 4 co-chairs: Chris Erdman, who many of you will know, who used to be with the AGU and is now at SciLife Lab as Director of Open Science, and has been involved with PIDs for many years. Jens Klump at CSIRO, who is one of the 2 co-parents, I guess is the word perhaps, for IGSNs, and certainly brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the group. Shaoli Chun from DataCite, who led the Fair Workflows project there, and myself at ResearchSpace, which provides RSpace, which is a digital research platform, which has been busily investigating and incorporating PIDs over the past couple of years. So I think it's a diverse group of co-chairs who have different kind of aspects we can bring to it. And the basic idea behind the formation of the group was that there is a huge amount of discussion about PIDs. There's massive and ever growing interest about PIDs, as we heard in the interest in PIDFest, for example, and all the other kinds of things that are being discussed. But certainly a couple of years ago, I think things are improving, and the Fair Workflows project is an example of that as well. But until relatively recently, the fact that in many cases use of PIDs will actually be used either through or in conjunction with research tools was an overlooked and critical element of the workflows that need to be implemented if PIDs are going to be widely adopted. And so the purpose of this group is really to kind of get down into the weeds and see, well, how do these workflows work, and how can research tools think about working with PIDs, incorporating PIDs, and supporting the use of PIDs. And the 3 groups that have expressed most interest by participating in our sessions are tools developers, for kind of obvious reasons, and also, interestingly, institutions, so data stewards, other people that actually are tasked an institution with adopting and implementing PIDs, because they have to think about the workflows that their researchers are using as well, and in conjunction with the tools their researchers are using. And then finally, PIDs providers themselves, including top of the list DataCite. So that's a bit of background to the group. Next slide, please. So in the past, we've had sessions where speakers spoke about incorporating IGSN IDs into research tools. We've looked quite a bit at joined up use of PIDs in workflows that involve multiple research tools, this interoperability theme, which is central. We've had data stewards and others talk about issues that they face in institutional implementation and adoption of PIDs. And we have a nice coordination with the National PID Strategies Working Group. And in fact, in Salzburg, we had our first joint session, which I think was great, and hope we can do more of that in the future. Next slide, please. So as I said, this session is actually this RDA rather has been really interesting. And I think we had some sessions which were breaking new ground for us a little bit. And I'll just touch on one thing in particular. So we had a talk on IGSNs and also PID-INST, which is a relatively new PID, which a lot of people are looking at and is developing. We had a really interesting talk this morning from Mikko Kolomansky talking about the incorporation of RAID into the EOS marketplace, which is not exactly a tool, but it was very interesting. And so that was a really interesting talk to think about how to make a PID more discoverable and interesting use of the marketplace. Then Shaoli spoke about incorporation of CDAR in the Fair Workflows project. And then the one which I'd like to just highlight briefly, because I thought there was great resonance with John's comments earlier. Matt Mayernick talked about a project that he's involved in, which I'm not sure of the exact relationship with National PID Strategies work that John is doing, but it certainly, I think it's related, and it certainly resonated. So this project it's very much taking the kind of US approach, which John described of taking a step back and looking at it kind of from a strategic level. In this particular case, they're looking at PIDs for facilities and instruments, and thinking and surveying the landscape of how currently in the US facilities and instruments make use of PIDs. Also looking at new things like PID-INST, but not confined to PID-INST. And one of the things which I thought was interesting, which I wasn't aware of, was it seems like fairly widespread use of RRIDs. So in the discussion, you have RRIDs and now IGSNs, both used for a kind of physical object samples. You also have PID-INST. So you have multiple PIDs which could potentially be used for similar purposes. So that was kind of interesting, I thought. And then I hesitate to use the word legacy because it doesn't sound very nice, but I was just wondering, and maybe John would be willing to comment on in his thinking, is because RRID, do you think maybe legacy is not the right word, but a polite word, a polite way, would RRID be an example of a quote unquote legacy PID, which is useful in being used, but which needs to be somehow modernized and brought into the modern PID framework? So I'll throw that question out to John, and I think that was my last slide anyway. Was it? Is there anything else? No. Okay.
Yep, that was it.
So I'll end with that question then.
Why? Why are you putting me on the spot, man?
Well, because, I love making people uncomfortable.
I actually don't know. I mean, I haven't actually done an analysis of RID's approach to its operations, so I actually don't know.
Okay.
We did struggle with the terminology of legacy PIDs. I mean, systems. We actually not legacy PIDs, legacy identifier systems. Mostly because our use cases are really in this that kind of created the framework. We're really in the idea of government and repository identifier systems that have been around for decades.
Okay.
And also the use cases of internal identifier systems that people use within their cataloging or databases that they kind of expose to the world and then state is the identifier for that system. And so we wanted to expose that those systems exist and they are powerful, and we wanted to create, discussions that would allow us to create transition plans. And so the category of things that we put in our report was really just a quick term that was put together for those use cases. But I do agree there are other examples of this, but I'm not sure if they fit in the same category as what our report was referring to, and they may actually fit more into the categories that Matt was referring to around those that would benefit from collaborations with more globally adopted and well understood systems. because one of the challenges that people have is around is not necessarily about following all the characteristics. It's also about doing that at scale and doing it in a way that the world understands. And so that's like another aspect of this criteria that you're bringing up, but also maybe would fit into this larger discussion that we've started.
Well, John, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I'm glad I did, and not surprisingly, you certainly rose to the occasion. And I actually thought your response to me was extremely informative. I have a better understanding now of what you actually meant by legacy PIDs. I think it's clear that RID is not a legacy PID, but it seems equally clear, or pretty clear to me, that it would usefully fall into the other category you mentioned, which is trying to bring it more in line with some of, as Matt was saying, with some of the systems which allow, for example, better relationships between PIDs and scalability. So thank you.
Larry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I can provide. I don't think anyone from Disco is here, so I'll stand in for Disco. I'm the chair of their technical advisory board. I can provide a nice non-controversial legacy identifier, which is most of the natural history museums have systems, legacy systems, catalog systems, and they have a lot of services that are dependent on those catalog numbers, but they are not unique, globally unique. So if you picture, I don't have that slide, but if you picture an institution providing access from the outside and then providing access from the inside, the current services can't go away. They have to stay there, and that's where the existing catalog numbers are useful for. But then you need to have access to all that from the outside. And the general approach to that, and DOI is one of the reasons they're going with DOI, is it's set up for that because you can provide a prefix in front of a DOI prefix in front of an existing identifier, and in that way, and generally provide some automatic registration of handles or dynamic registration of handles, and that way you can bring it into the modern world, as was being said. So that's certainly the kind of legacy identifier that's easy to talk about.
Great, thanks, Larry. I think looking at the time, we need to move on to John. Are you there, John? John Uspler?
Yep, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Cool. It's been a really, yeah, absolutely. This has been a great conversation. I'm very happy to be participating in this PID SLAM. So yeah, I'm John Aspler. I'm the manager of the Canadian Persistent Identifier Community at the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, CRKN, and I'll be talking a little bit about the National PID Strategies Interest Group on behalf of my co-chairs. Next slide, please. So I guess just to speak to the purpose of the National PID Strategies Interest Group, it's ultimately there to help with the exchange of information internationally across a variety of jurisdictions where, we're all doing very similar work and we don't want to be duplicating and replicating effort, although our unique national and regional contexts are important for the work we're doing. So ultimately, the goal here is to coordinate and align streamlined efforts, specifically via RDA. And I should highlight that this interest group was previously a working group. I was not a co-chair at that time. I think Chris Brown was on this call until just a moment ago. He was involved for a very long time. But all that to say that we transitioned from a working group over to an RDA Council endorsed interest group. And ultimately, we will be continuing to maintain and build on the outputs of that former working group, which is now closed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm the co-chair from Canada. My colleagues here, Natasha Simons at the ARDC in Australia, Chris Brown, JISC UK, and Hanna Herengova at NTK in the Czech Republic. You're probably familiar with some or all of them. One thing I want to highlight, which Josh also highlighted, is that at RDA, I think in particular RDA 20 in Gothenburg, early 2023, folks like Natasha and Hanna started talking, and they are the co-chairs of PIDFest. So without RDA, and in particular the collaborative, the space that is the National PID Strategies Working and Now Interest Group, I'm not sure the PIDFest necessarily would have happened, or at least it wouldn't have happened in the form that it exists now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, the interest group, we had a working group. It lasted the typical RDA timeframe of about 18 months. And ultimately, the main output was a guide/checklist for uptake and alignment of national PID strategies, which generally are on the rise. And I should say that this was not necessarily the original goal for an output. Really, I think initially the idea was to create some kind of magic formula for people to create, develop, implement PID strategies in their own contexts. But of course, totally unsurprisingly, as it turns out, there is no one-size-fits-all approach here. Not to mention that each jurisdiction has wildly different needs and also maybe at a very different stage, very advanced in the development of a strategy or starting something completely from scratch. So ultimately, what the working group did was via these 9 case studies from these different national contexts, they developed a checklist of potential key features that your PID strategy could use nationally. But, you know, it's sort of a pick and choose approach. If you are developing something from scratch, there might be something you need to start with developing a value proposition. But if you're in the middle of implementing one or you've already done a lot of the work, maybe you are doing something a little bit different. And it was great to hear that John and the folks in the US had been engaging with this as well. Next slide, please. So basically, as I said, PID strategies nationally are on the rise. There's no singular cookie cutter approach, but some critical components, which may look different in each region, but still are critical to a successful national PID strategy, might include a clear value proposition with use cases, some group, organization, entity that is responsible for driving strategy development. In Canada, we have an advisory committee called the Canadian PID Advisory Committee, made up of about 30 organizations who are all across the research ecosystem and a variety of different sectors. They're centrally involved in this, for example. We have the need for an open, inclusive, iterative process. PIDs go across every part of the landscape. You all know this. It's impossible to do a national PID strategy without buy-in from a variety of different stakeholders, from government entities to universities to publishers locally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, ideally, concrete next steps, things that you can specifically act on and do and implement. And then outside of the national context, of course, it's important to engage internationally, either with others who are developing PID strategies or specifically with the, of course, central PID provider agencies. We have an ORCID consortium that we manage at CRKN. We have a data site consortium that we manage at CRKN. These kinds of opportunities to engage and create communities are central to driving our PID strategy. Next slide, please. I'll just say here that you are free to go take a look at those outputs like that checklist. You can find them on the RDA's Zenodo community or the National PID Strategies Working Group website. Next slide, please. So just a brief thank you to the RDA Tiger. Of course, again, I was not involved at this stage. I only came on when we became an interest group, but my understanding is that the RDA Tiger helped create a white paper and a designed version of the checklist. Next slide, please. You can see what that looks like here. Very nice graphics. Next slide. This is sort of a close-up view of parts of the checklist. Again, nice icons, nice graphics. Again, it is not a stepwise approach. We're not saying you must do 1, then 2, then 3. The idea is that as a nation, as a region, you might be doing something specific, and here are some things you can pull at as needed based on your specific context. Next slide, please. So I'll be quick here. I think I'm coming up against time. So basically, we have 5 activities mapped to goals. The first is, of course, that it's important to be engaging across all of our national contexts, and the working group use cases are a big part of all of this, and we want to make sure that we are not just using our old ones, we want to be updating them, we want to be engaging over time with all the groups that have already engaged and new ones that have not yet engaged with us before. It's not a static process collecting use cases and building a checklist. It's a dynamic process, and it's always ongoing. The second goal here is just to highlight the importance of engaging with, again, those international PID agencies. Because it's not just about your local PID service providers, the agencies in your country that are doing things, but we need to have that central connection. Next slide, please. Just to say here that, we are looking at this question of value proposition. It's going to depend on a lot of different contexts. Even hearing from John earlier, the importance of this tactical approach to addressing a totally different language used in the context of RFPs, or how we might get ORCID into systems and compare and contrast it with other PIDs for people. That might be a very particular kind of value proposition that's needed. Then that might be different to another context. So even so, we really want to work on this kind of collaborative approach to these clearer value propositions across the landscape. Next slide, please. We really want to keep collecting case studies and updating the ones we already have. I believe when the working group started, they collected some of those 9 use cases, and over those 18 months, they radically changed. So of course, updates were needed from beginning to end. But also, one of the criticisms that I believe the working group had received was that, the 9 countries that provided use cases were typically, I believe, all from the global north, or mostly from the global north. And what I can say to that is that, of course, this was an open call for cases. So we received the ones we received. We would love to have more from other places, but it's also one of the reasons why our presentations this year, the RDA National PID Strategies Working Interest Group sessions, were focused on equity and inclusion. We really wanted to address that question of, why didn't we get these use cases? How can we move forward the conversations in other regions where this is definitely happening, but it's happening differently, and it's happening differently with different needs and concerns that maybe we haven't all been talking about. So we need to really engage there. And then, of course, lastly, again, that guidance checklist, it is not a static guidance checklist. We will continue to update it as we get those new case studies and we start to think about, or I should say, continue to think about those questions of equity and inclusion globally. Next slide. So these sessions have already, of course, happened. There were 2 versions of this. Next slide, please. You are welcome to go check them out online. Would recommend it. Both have very different groups of people talking, but they were both excellent, very different kinds of conversations and things that I think we really need to start thinking about in the PID landscape globally. Next slide, please. And maybe actually one other thing I should say about equity is that it's not just about engaging with places and countries that may not have had the ability to engage before. It's also within our context. In the Canadian context, we are bilingual. We know that we are underserving Francophone communities, and we need to address that. In both Canada and Australia, there are questions of how we can engage effectively with Indigenous communities on questions of data sovereignty and their relationship to PIDs. These are not just international equity concerns. This is also within national contexts. And with that, Josh has already talked a lot about PIDFest. There is a National PID Strategy session block here, which I would invite folks to check out. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Fantastic timing. We've got 3 minutes left. So first of all, if there are questions, we could probably have one question now if there is one. If not, I'd encourage you please to ask questions to the collaborative notes. Excuse me, myself and the co-chairs will be reviewing the notes and coming up with a summary. So if you do have any questions that occur to you that you haven't had a chance to ask, or that occur to you after we've finished, then please use the collaborative notes to do that, and we'll get back to you. It just remains really for me to thank all the speakers very much indeed. Thank you for your wonderful timekeeping and your presentations. I'll send you a note and ask you all individually if you're okay with me posting the slides, but I'll do that straight after this is finished. So with that, I'd like to close this session. Thank everyone very much for your participation, and see you next time. I'm not sure whether we will have a session in Costa Rica, because I don't know if any of us is actually going to go there. But if not, the next one after that, I'm sure we'll be there. So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
On behalf of everyone, thanks for running the session so well, Jonathan. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Jonathan, you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay. So I had one more comment I was going to make. Maybe I can put it.
Oh.
But in thinking about these strategies, these national strategies, there's a clear distinction between some of the kinds of PIDs and that are associated only with scholarly activity and the general idea, precision identifiers. And the easy example is ORCIDs. ORCIDs have been great for the scholarly community, but they're self-assigned, so they're a non-starter in other areas of activity.
Yeah.
So that might be that's a sort of a general distinction in terms of forming national strategies.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I think when you're in the scholarly world, it's very difficult to think outside of it. So, and of course, your terms are general. So you sort of make the assumption that that's your world,
Right.
and it's actually something. It's one of the things that I think holds us back actually in the foundation a bit, because we're all, everyone on the board knows their world and they know what they know, and so it's sort of scary. If I go off and talk to industry on the internet, I mean, I don't know if you remember years and years back when the World Bank came to Norman and asked him if we would consider doing legal entity identifiers.
Yeah, well, sure. That was actually the Basel folks. Yeah, Norman and I were advisors to that group, the legal entity identifier. And
it was sort of
it was a funny connection.
But I think it was so far distant from the reality at that time that it was very difficult to bridge to it. But I think this issue of legacy is interesting. Also, it was a good nuance today, better than the first session, where there are different types of legacies. So there are established identifiers that are just not well connected with everything else, which might be a different problem to, say, a system that doesn't have a good resolver and that needs resolution services added to it. But yeah. I think there's something here. I'm going to noodle with the other co-chairs and come up with something, because I think I think Todd and John and their group are onto something here. Because actually there are an awful lot of identifiers out there that people in good faith have fired up. And they come across, they're just not able to scale because they never thought of it.
Yeah, there is some discomfort associated with this, because you're telling some groups of people that they're, no longer, valid. But it would be a brave and good session to maybe somewhat. I don't know. You might wind up with some angry people, but it should be confronted at some point.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, we were a bit disappointing on numbers again, but
yes, and I did. I don't know. I was going to save the comments till later, but I didn't feel much energy myself. I actually didn't think it was as good as the first session.
No, it's funny. Yeah, it's the guy who was hosting us, helping us out, said he was on sessions yesterday where only 3 people, there were all of the speakers and then 3 others.
Okay, well, it's the end, right? This is the last breakout session, so maybe
the last breakout. But
yeah, so maybe
I don't know. I think it's
I don't know if there's any good way to do virtual conferences.
No, it's funny because I remember last one we did was just fantastic. We got a huge engagement, but maybe it was I don't know. I really don't know. Anyway, thank you so much.
I'll leave you alone. Thanks.
Okay, we'll go.
Talk to you next week.
Sharing. Okay. Oh, next week I have to cancel